Hi, it's Mrs. Angotti, and we're recording a video which goes through the examples from the 13-4, 13-5 handout. So we left off where we had looked at the basic forms and we had talked about the patterns that you would see when you're graphing sine, and we had left off here with the patterns for sine. So the patterns for sine were that we wanted to mark off these 5 important points. And those 5 important points, of course, would indicate to us the major parts of one complete period. So features to remember we went over was the idea that the sine curve starts at the midline and we also said that it follows the pattern of midline, maximum, midline, minimum, and then back to the midline. We also said, let me switch colors here. We also said that this was indicating the beginning of the period, 1/4 of the period, 1/2 of the period, 3/4 of the period, and then the end of the period. And we also had mentioned that this pattern we saw was for A, positive, and then the change that happened, let me switch colors again. The change that happened was if A was negative, you would do midline, minimum, you're going to go down first, midline, maximum, and then you're going to come back to the midline, and that would be if A is negative. Okay, so that's where we left off in class, and the other thing I mentioned to you guys is that you would calculate your tick marks on here. You would want to calculate 1/4 of the period, and that number will tells you what you are counting by in on the x-axis. Okay, so with that being said, the next thing that would happen is we didn't get to talking about a cosine graph. So for that cosine graph, notice that my 5 important points are here, 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 and my 5th one is here. And again, we can see that our one complete period would be this distance here of 2 pi. So what I want you to notice is that the cosine curve starts at, and you can probably see it, it's going to start at a max. And again, that happens if A is positive. Now, your 5 important points, or the pattern you're going to follow, will be then that you will do, let me switch colors here, you will do maximum, midline, minimum, midline, and then maximum. You'll end at the maximum. And once again, just like in the previous example, this indicated the beginning, the end, half the period, 1/4 the period, and 3/4 of the period. Squeeze that in there. Okay, and again, this is if A is positive. If A turns out to be negative, let me switch again. Let's go purple. If A turns out to be negative, you will flip, so you will start at the minimum, midline, maximum, midline, back to the minimum. And again, that's if A is negative. Okay, so, and again, same concept, you still want a quarter of the period to decide how you're going to count. So let's see that at work. So on the next page, these first few examples, I'm only going to do a couple of them. All it's asking you for is to just read the equation and come up with the amplitude and the period. So for number 1, your amplitude, you would want to look right here at this number, and your amplitude would be 1/2. Your period would end up being 2 pi over b, which means it would be 2 pi over 3, because again, that's your b. So 2 pi over 3. While we're here, just for argument's sake, you should keep in mind with an amplitude of 1/2, you'd have a maximum of 1/2, and you'd have a minimum of negative 1/2. Let's take a look at number 3. Number 3, my amplitude would be 4, and the period is going to be a little tougher to figure out here. I want to do 2 pi over b, but the b is this crazy number of 4 pi over 3. Well, that's some division happening. So what I want to do is I'd change this into a division problem. When we divide by a fraction, we flip the fraction and we change it to multiplication, at which point my pi's will cancel each other out, the 2 and the 4 will reduce, and I will end up with a period of 3 over 2 radians. The pi just goes away. So that's the amplitude and the period. And let's do one more, number 5. The amplitude here will be positive 2. Amplitude is a distance. You always want the absolute value of your A, and so amplitude here will be 2. The period will be 2 pi over b. This time the b is 3/4. I do the same division thing. So 2 pi times the flipped fraction, 4/3, will end up being 8 pi over 3 as the period of this function. Okay, so those are the examples with amplitude and period, and then it gets into graphing the function. Okay, so to graph the function, first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and erase this just so it's out of my way. And then we're going to proceed to do this problem. So first thing I want to do is find 5 items that would be helpful to me in graphing. And those 5 items are going to be, of course, the amplitude, the period, the max, the min, and the midline is also good to know. So our amplitude we can read is a 2. Our period is 2 pi over 2, which is pi. Our maximum, since our midline will be y equals 0, our maximum will be 2, and our minimum will be negative 2. So with that in mind, I go ahead and on my graph space here, I can go ahead and draw in my y-axis, and I'm going to go ahead and draw in my x-axis. Sorry, it's supposed to be on this line. Kind of make it a little bit thicker. Okay, so because my max and my min are 2 and negative 2, that tells me I only have to label up to 2 on the y-axis and down to negative 2 on the y-axis. Okay, now I have to figure out what tick marks I want to put on my x-axis. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to calculate what 1/4 of the period is. So 1/4 of the period would be 1/4 of pi, which will be pi over 4. That means I'm going to count by 1/4 of a pi. So I go ahead and I make these tick marks on my axis, and the first tick mark will be pi over 4. Whoops, sorry about that. The first tick mark will be pi over 4. So I go ahead and I make this pi over 4. My second tick mark, this is 1/4 pi, will be 2/4 pi, which is pi over 2. 3/4 pi, 1 full pi, the end of the period. So it looks like some numbers change themselves here. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that. This would be negative 2 at this tick mark right here. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and follow the pattern of my sine curve. So it starts at the midline, which means my first dot is going to be right here. From the midline, because A is positive, it's going to go up to the maximum at that first important dot. Let's try to make that happen. There we go. Then it's going to go back to the midline for the second or third dot now. And then it's going to drop down to the minimum. And then it's going to go back up to the midline. I then use those dots to draw in one complete period. I want to go ahead and show that it's going to keep going. And on this end, same thing. I put an arrow to show it's going to keep going. Now, take a moment and ask yourself, if we're counting by fourths, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, what would the next label be for that spot? Well, if you said, well, that's going to be 5 pi over 4, you are correct. And where would I put my dot? Well, hopefully you said that you'd put your dot at 2, and the graph would continue, and I'd show the turn, and I'd put the arrow to show it's going to keep going. Okay, so there's one graphing the function. And then I'm going to go ahead, and I think I'm going to run out of time here. So we are going to stop the video right here. That should hopefully get you rolling and set you up to do your homework. All right, thanks a lot, and I'll see you guys later.